going live in a moment. I think so, anyway. Brilliant. Well, welcome to everyone, especially the people joining us on the live stream. You'll probably have guessed that I'm not James Halstead. He's come down with COVID, and he's fine, but he's not here tonight. So I'm going to be doing this evening's talk. Now, I hope we've got some notes. One or two people have already looked at me and said those look a little bit scary. Please don't be scared by them. They're basically what I'm speaking from tonight. So some of the stuff is just to help me sort of remember what I was meant to be saying. And also, it'll mean if there's a sort of an argument or a sort of discussion or point you didn't quite catch because I didn't speak it right, hopefully you should find it in the notes somewhere as well. Because last time when Jane spoke about this topic of suffering, the focus was very much on the sense of the suffering that comes from being a follower of Jesus Christ. The sense that part of our calling as being his disciples will in some ways produce a kind of suffering persecution in our lives. And how do we understand that? How do we cope with that? How do we actually grow, not just through that, but in some senses because of that? So that was last time. Though this time, with this theme of credo, of understanding belief, we're going to talk a little bit more about, well, how does the rest of suffering in life make sense with a belief in God? I'm going to be doing essentially what's called an apologetic. How can we make sense of life, make sense of faith, make sense of being followers of Jesus Christ, a good God, a good shepherd, all this sort of stuff, in a world in which there is pain and suffering. And what I want to understand is essentially how is it that suffering becomes not just is not just not a barrier to faith, but how is suffering something that in some senses becomes a revelation of faith and even a way into faith? That's basically what I want to do tonight. Does that sound like it might be worthwhile to discuss together? Now, here's the thing. I said I'm doing an apologetic. I'm not doing a pastoral talk, as it were. We are going to be talking sort of some bits of philosophy, some bits of all this sort of thing. However, suffering is a lot more than an academic lecture. It's something that's personal, and if it's stuff that comes up in groups that personal stuff needs some space, which I've not given it in the talk, feel free to go off the rails a bit and do what you need to do. The personal elements of suffering matters massively, and I'm aware that's not the focus of tonight, so if it needs to be a focus in your groups, that's absolutely okay. Okay, let's start talking about suffering, and I'm going to begin by talking about culture. Because here's the thing, for many Western people today, a secular Western culture, suffering is seen as an absolutely insurmountable obstacle to believing in God. And that brings with it some quite interesting consequences. So for one thing, to us as Westerners, we have a strong sense that the purpose of life is all to do with me being an individual, living the best life and the happiest life and the life that I choose to live. Freedom to be able to live life the way I want to live it and find happiness in the things I want to do is so core to our identity as human beings, as contemporary Westerners. And that gives us a massive challenge when suffering comes into our life, because so much about suffering takes away our happiness, takes away our choices, takes away our freedom, and doesn't let us live the life that we as individuals want to live. I was chatting to someone outside a butcher's the other day who was talking about her cancer treatment and saying that, the nurse has told me that cancer treatment will put my life on hold for a whole year. And that was the language she used. The suffering, the experience, it took life away. It put life on hold. That's, if you like, sort of... so when we as Westerners engage with suffering, the question we often have in our minds is, okay, suffering's come up. How do I limit it? How do I get rid of it? How do I fix it? Do I need to sort of go on runs for breast cancer or this or that or the other? What do I need to do to solve the problem and get on with living life that I want to do? So we really struggle to find a positive place for suffering in our lives. And so actually when insurmountable suffering comes into our life, it can be utterly devastating and utterly soul-destroying. I hope that sort of kind of makes a sense of, and now you might have a slightly different take on that because we're all individuals, but that's just be trying to very crudely summarize our cultural experience of suffering. But here's the first key point of the evening. That experience and that perspective is not universal. It's not the only view of suffering in the world. So I've got up on the screen there some other sort of worldviews, and let me just summarize a little bit about what they are. So you might have heard of ideas of karma found within sort of a lot of Eastern and Indian religion. Hinduism is probably the strongest perspective on that. So this idea of there being a moralistic reason for suffering. So the idea is this: if you are suffering, there's a reason for it. There's some area of your life that is defective. You've not been doing the right thing, and so suffering is like a wake-up call. Oh my word! I need to fix things. I need to be a better person. I need to sort this out, either in this life or in the life to come. Again, it's expressed in lots of different forms, but essentially, suffering is not so much a bad thing, it's a wake-up call. I'm doing something wrong, I need to get it right, I need to get my life back on tracks. So that's one perspective. Another perspective is what we might call the sort of the Stoic perspective, or in Eastern thought, a Buddhist perspective. Here the sense of suffering is something which arises from a distorted sense of the self. There is a belief that suffering is because I've not understood properly the natural order of things, or not been properly reconciled to the natural order of things. So what I need is a sense of detachment, a sense of perspective, a sense to get everything in proportion again, and then I'll be okay. I'll be sort of, rather than suffering gathering me here, there, and everywhere, I'll be tranquil, I'll be at peace. There's also a sort of fatalistic idea of suffering. So we talk within sort of Greek tragedies about sort of the fates and the gods doing all their thing, or there's a fairly strong stream of Islamic thought about the inscrutable will of Allah. And that sometimes it's just the will of the gods to bring suffering into our lives. And when it comes, then our job is to face that heroically or faithfully. You know, if Allah has brought suffering to my life, then the best thing I can do is to be as firm in my convictions and, you know, keep doing the right thing despite this suffering. That's how I engage with the inscrutable will of the gods. Finally, in contrast to the fatalistic ideas that have a very strong idea of here is God and he knows what he's doing, there can be a sense that God sometimes doesn't even quite have things work out for him the way that he wants it to. There can be an idea of our world today being a cosmic battle between good and evil. And we as people on the side of good are sort of caught in the sort of crossfire a bit sometimes, or like sort of soldiers sort of going over trenches. There's a battle between light and darkness, and so we shouldn't be surprised that sometimes we get wounded in that conflict. And in fact, in some senses, we can take it as being sort of a sign that we are fighting on the right side. You know, why would the forces of darkness be sending suffering into my world if I wasn't doing something right and something to sort of to challenge them? And that can either be a sort of a spiritualized idea, but it can also be something that is actually quite secularized. So within Marxist thought, that sense of, you know, if the capitalist classes are against me, then that's a sign that I'm doing the right thing, or all that sort of thing. So these dualistic ideas. Now, okay. Why am I bothering to talk about all this stuff around culture? Well, simply it's this. As Westerners, we think, oh, this whole suffering thing, surely it must mean that God is totally implausible. Most of our fellow human beings, for most of history, would disagree with us in that assessment. So if for nothing else, just have this sense that there is more to this question of suffering than our culture would let us initially appreciate. And I just hope some of that cultural contrast stuff is helpful to that. But secondly, it might be worth noticing that the ideas I've just described, did they sort of ring some bells with people? Did they seem in some way familiar? Yeah? Part of the reason for that is because we as Westerners, I said at the start, struggle to engage with suffering from our own cultural perspective. We can't find a good reason for it. So when faced with suffering, particularly insurmountable suffering, it's not unusual for us to try and go sort of import some other ideas from other worldviews. And so we have a sort of familiarity with other ways of approaching suffering, even if they might be inconsistent with either a sort of historical Christian or a modern secular approach to life. And yet we still have those things hanging around in our heads and our culture. And quite often there's a sense of, okay, I'm a secular person, don't believe in God, but something really bad has happened, so so maybe I'll borrow a bit of karma or a bit of this or a bit of stoicism to get me over the hurdle, and then I can go back to being a secular person again. And that might be something we find a temptation in our lives. We certainly will see it within the cultures around us. So to have this broader cultural perspective of the sort of various different sort of cultural comfort blankets for suffering that we might accumulate around us, it is helpful to be aware of, and also help for us to say, well, hang on, I don't just want a cultural comfort blanket, I want something that is more robust, that is more real, that is more deep-seated in what I actually believe as a Christian, rather than just going begging and borrowing from other worldviews. Does that make sense? And so what I want to try to do tonight is to try and understand, okay, what is a distinctively Christian approach to suffering? Though before we get to that point, it is worth noticing that all of those worldviews which I've just outlined have within them an element of truth. So, for example, to the view of karma, the Christian, the Bible would want to say, well, yeah, there is a sort of a problem of sin in the world, the sort of Genesis 3, the fall and stuff, but just as we've seen within the book of Job and Psalms like Psalm 73, that is not an adequate explanation for all suffering and personal suffering. It's one thing to say, okay, the world is broken because of sin, but that does not mean that a sinner is suffering because of an individual sin. That's something which the Bible doesn't allow us to do. We don't have a concept of karma. Similarly, just because someone's life is going well, it doesn't mean they are living a life of moral virtue. The world is more complicated than that. It is broken, there's sin out there, but to say, oh, you've had that terrible thing happen to you, you must be a sinner, that's something the Bible has no truck with, and is one of the main points of the book of Job. Or take stoicism. Self-control, a big virtue in the Bible, saying that sort of brings within us a sense of godliness and the purposes of God, and yet the Bible says, no, we're not called for just stoic indifference, we are called for love. Meaningful, deep, passionate love with a personal God who is at the heartbeat of the very universe. There's nothing stoic about that. Similarly, the Bible does agree that suffering is inevitable within our life. Jesus said to his disciples on the night of the crucifixion, in your lives you will have troubles, and yet he doesn't say, but fight fiercely against them and you'll be okay. He says, yeah, but I've overcome them. Your strength is in me, not within the heroicism of your personal faith. Or finally, with the sort of dualistic stuff, there is a sense that personal evil is indeed very powerful, and yet it is totally under God's control, ultimately brings about its own destruction, and also ultimately brings about only God's good purposes. So that's a little sort of whistle-stop tour of sort of comparative cultures and comparative religions, though the key point for this evening is that none of that is the answer to suffering from a Christian perspective, because from a Christian point of view, suffering is not answered by an ultimate philosophy of life, an ultimate philosophy of suffering. The question of suffering is answered by an ultimate person, Jesus Christ. And it's our relationship, our understanding, our connection with him in which these questions around suffering make their resolution. And so the cultural questions can sort of stop us see that. Also things, the philosophical questions can stop us seeing that. And what I hope to do tonight is to be able to look at some of those underpinning questions of philosophy and thought and reason, but with the awareness that ultimately those will only be satisfying answers if they lead us eventually to Jesus Christ and him crucified. Am I still making sense to people? Sorry I can't see you on the camera, but the people here, does that sound like it? Okay, cool. I'm getting some nods. So, okay, because here's the thing. With culture, as I said before, for much of human history, this question of suffering has not been a problem. Our ancestors faced far greater suffering than we ever will, God willing, and yet they still believed in God. Around the world today, there's still terrible infant mortality, hardship about food, all sorts of stuff, and yet belief in God is still there. It is this cultural question we have as Westerners that prevents us from realizing that there are, in fact, good answers to the logical questions of suffering, the moral questions of suffering, and the emotional questions of suffering. But unless we sort of engage with some of these cultural barriers in our hearts, we never receive those things as good answers. So what I'm going to do for the rest of our session tonight is to very quickly run through what those good answers to the logical question of suffering, the moral question of suffering, running out of breath, and the emotional question of suffering look like, and then we can sort of have a bit of chat about how they apply to us. Good? Brilliant. So let's kick off with the, now I may need to advance the slides a bit here. There we go, that looks good. So, some Greek philosopher bloke, and note the date, 300 years BC. As I said, this question of suffering is not a new one to our culture. This has been thought about by human beings for ages. So he said, if God knows about evil and suffering, cares about evil and suffering, and can do something about evil and suffering, then there shouldn't be any. But there is evil and suffering, therefore a God like this cannot exist. That's what I mean by the logical problem of suffering. And if you've not heard that quote, you've probably sort of thought about that yourself or heard similar ideas expressed. Yeah. So here's the interesting thing. That is not a idea used by contemporary philosophers to disprove God. And this is why. There turns out to be two quite fundamental logical philosophical problems with this argument. The first is with that statement, there is evil and suffering. Because here's the thing. Evil and suffering are moral concepts. There's not an atom called evil and a molecule called suffering. They are moral constructs. And so they do not exist without a moral framework. So where does this moral framework come from? Well, either it comes from some sort of moral reality, an ultimate moral reality, a God, which is what you're trying to disprove in the first place, or it comes from some sort of personal construct or cultural construct, in which case all we're saying is, well, I don't really feel like believing God, or my culture doesn't tell me to believe in God, so I don't. We're not actually exercising reason and logic here. We're just sort of doing what our culture tells us is right. I would say not believing in God kind of thing. Make sense? Or the second, and this is actually the stronger problem, it turns out, because, and it is within that word, then there shouldn't be any. Essentially, that deduction is unsubstantiated. Because why can't, most of our cultures, most human beings would agree that actually the gods can have perfectly reasonable reasons for allowing a degree of suffering. The only trouble is we might not quite always understand them. So for us, the question is, okay, we say, well, God can't possibly let me suffer. Well, why can't there be a perfectly reasonable moral explanation for God to allow an amount of suffering in our lives? It's just that we don't understand it, we can't assess it. In order to sort of say that there is no possible reason that a God could allow suffering, we would have to imbue ourselves essentially with the qualities of God. We'd have to give ourselves sort of infinite wisdom, infinite knowledge, infinite power, the capacity to see all possibilities. In other words, we would have to make ourselves God in order to make that judgment. And yet we're trying to disprove God, which is what we've just argued exists, or at least made ourselves God in his place. Again, does that make sense here? If not, I hope the sort of notes I've written there do. So that gives a flavour of the sorts of reasons why the logical argument is something which is not used today within sort of discussions about the existence of God. In fact, it's more commonly used by Christians or other theistic philosophers to argue for the existence of God. And the same very much goes for the moral problem. The question, okay, well, it might be logical that there's suffering, but is it right that there's suffering? Is it moral that there's suffering? Now, you can actually use the same arguments from logic that I've just outlined, and the problems, again, is essentially that you end up making yourself God. In order to make a moral complaint against God, basically saying, God, you're immoral for having all this suffering rubbish going on, you essentially have to give yourselves the ethical qualities of a God in order to judge God. That's where the sort of the logical moral stuff goes down, but that's not what I'm focused on today, because the basic thing is saying, okay, let's suppose that this suffering thing has a glimmer of philosophical and moral credibility to it. Then the door is open to saying, well, okay, what reasons might there be for God justifiably allowing suffering in the world? And the Bible has a lot of them, though interestingly, no one of them seems to be a complete explanation for suffering. So you've probably heard a sort of a free will argument, that sense of for human beings to be able to meaningfully do good and to meaningfully love people and meaningfully love God, we've got to have the choice and the freedom and the capacity to choose not to do those things. And sometimes we do, which is a very good explanation for the sort of the evil like sort of murder or that sort of stuff, or injustice, of human injustice, but perhaps not such a terribly good explanation of things like earthquakes and disease and whatnot. Though there's another argument to say the cosmic consequences of sin. If we think that human beings are not all they're cracked up to be, and that God may have decided, well, actually, we're not worthy of living in paradise, then if we don't think that we're perhaps perfect and worthy of living in paradise, why should we be surprised that we're not living here? If we are not sort of perfectly moral, perfectly good, why should we be thinking we should be living in Eden, or the equivalent of it? So there's something to play there. The cosmic consequences of sin, the eternal perspective on it. Even the older of us among it, I won't ask who's the oldest in the room tonight, but maybe 60, 70, who knows? That is just a short slice in eternity. Do we quite see these momentary trials of suffering in a proper perspective? Maybe, maybe not. There's also a sense there is experience in our human lives of some suffering being positive. Now, if we, as limited human beings, with limited knowledge, limited capacity, can see some good purposes in some suffering, why cannot a God with infinite capacity, infinite reason, infinite insight, see even more and even better and even fuller purposes in suffering? So there's the experience of positive suffering. Secondly, I've lost count of how much we are. Why do we think that life is about happiness? That's a very sort of secular Western idea. Why do you think it's God's job to make me happy in the moment? What if God has some other purpose of which my happiness is just a part and something which is achieved at another point within that process? If God's purpose is to sort of conform me to Christ, to sort of bring something of his image, restore it in me, then if that is his aim, why can't suffering play a perfectly moral purpose within that? And finally, and again, there's scripture quotations in the notes that talk about all this, but probably my favourite of all is, well, what if suffering really is too complicated for us to get in a nutshell? We're assuming here that we can understand divine purpose, and maybe we can to an extent, though I'd like to suggest we perhaps would be a bit foolish if we think that if God was just to have 5 minutes to us, we'd understand it all. So that's a sense of some of the moral justifications for why suffering is potentially permissible. But I say again, none of those on their own are meant to be a full explanation. The Bible does not give us a complete, prepackaged, neat, tidy, all-inclusive explanation for suffering. I guess that's part of what faith is about. But anyway, that's something we can discuss on our table. So let's move on to the third, I suppose, objection we have against suffering, which is something called the emotional argument or the visceral argument. And let's have a break from me speaking for a moment, because I'm hoping we've got a little video that sums up the argument better than I can.
Suppose what Oscar believed in as he died, in spite of your protestations, suppose it's all true, and you walk up to the pearly gates and you are confronted by God. What will Stephen Fry say to him, her, or it?
I will basically, what's known as theodicy, I think. I'll say bone cancer in children? What's that about? How dare you? How dare you create a world in which there is such misery that is not our fault? It's not right. It's utterly, utterly evil. Why should I respect a capricious, mean-minded, stupid God who creates a world which is so full of injustice and pain? That's what I would say.
On again. Brilliant. I don't know if you remember that. It happened, I think, about 5, 6, 7, maybe more years ago. Interviewed in Ireland, and I think Stephen Fry was charged with blasphemy by the Irish police or something about it, for this interview he gave in which he said, well, I can't believe in God because God is just ethically revolting. How can he allow bone cancer in children or whatever? It's not so much a sort of a logical argument as it is an argument of just raw emotion. Technically, within discourse, it's called the visceral argument. That say, okay, well, maybe there's all this clever logical philosophy stuff that says God might be plausible, but come on, guys, this whole idea of a God who lets things like happens to it, that just gouges at my very being. I can't possibly believe in a God like that. And I think Stephen Fry sums it up very well. Okay, how might we engage with raw emotion here? Well, let me suggest the following. First of all, it's important to realize that not everyone who experiences terrible suffering loses their faith. The argument actually goes in different ways. The testimony of Holocaust survivors, you find some people have their faith destroyed through the experience of Holocaust, some people have their faith rebuilt. And you're thinking, how on earth can that be? Well, clearly, there is something about this visceral argument where the emotional logic is capable of going both ways. So, yeah, sure, something terrible can come into my life, or I can see something terrible happening in the life of others, and I can say, oh, that's just so awful. There can't be a God. There can't be more than that. There just cannot be anything more than this suffering. It's so awful. I can't conceive of anything better. But the same emotion surely can work in the exact opposite thing. You could say, well, this is just so awful. This can't be the end of the story. There must be something more than this. You know, the same event, the same emotional logic, but it can actually work in both ways and does work in both directions. People go through terrible trauma, and it brings them to God. People go through terrible trauma, and they lose their faith in God. So just right off the back there, we've got to admit that though the visceral argument is powerful, it is actually powerful in both directions. So it's a sort of question, okay, well, which direction should we travel in? The key point here is this. Often with the visceral argument, what we are seeing is the world, the natural world, as it is. So when we see sort of the Holocaust, or when we see terrible sort of bugs going into children's eyes and all that sort of stuff, or earthquakes or this, what we are seeing there is the natural order of things doing the things that natural orders do. We are seeing survival of the fittest. We are seeing weak genes being weeded out of the gene pool. We are seeing this, we're seeing that. We are seeing nature in operation. You know, in sort of the whole The Lion King song where they have a cycle of life or whatever it is. Well, we're seeing the cycle of life, only it's not Hollywood, it's gritty, and when we see it for as it is and experience it for as it is, it gut-wrenches us. And so it's a question, well, why am I responding to that, to something which should be natural to me? If I'm a product of all this, and you know, I'm here because of a relentless grind of evolutionary processes and survival of the fittest, why do I viscerally find such a dissonance in my being between what I'm saying? Why do I want to rant and rave against the world which I'm supposedly made for? Well, C.S. Lewis pondered the question, could that be our hearts testifying to us that actually we're not made for this world of suffering, we're made for another world? Sort of a very visceral hatred we have in this world for seemingly unjustified, unnecessary, pointless suffering is pointing to our hearts that we were made for another one. Or again, there's a quotation from C.S. Lewis there, unless we allow ultimate reality to be moral, we cannot condemn it. In other words, our visceral objection to this world is saying that actually, is it my heart crying out for another better world? In summary, if we believe in a world of death and suffering are wrong, we are saying on some level we are made for a world in which those things don't exist. Does that sort of make sense? Again, there's so much more we could say on this, but I'm aware that time is running out. So let me conclude and let me finish with what this is all about. So we've said that Christ, so I said at the start that we will never sort of become sort of followers of Jesus Christ just through clever arguments of philosophy and ethics and all this sort of stuff. Suffering needs to bring us to Christ. So the question is not just how has clever philosophy answered our questions of suffering, but how has Christ addressed them? Well, the Bible says very simply this: Christ has resolved the logical problems of suffering. By taking that question, well, can God and suffering coexist? Christ Jesus says, yes, they can. Because he, as the crucified Christ, the suffering Christ, becomes the ultimate revelation of God. Suffering reveals God, not hides God. Can the moral questions around suffering be resolved in Christ? Well, yes, they can, because Christ is the ultimate suffering material, moral, social, existential, spiritual pain, and through those things, achieving the ultimate good. His ultimate suffering for a purpose, if that was something which was meaningful and justified, then surely our lesser suffering in that same purpose must be also. And finally, the emotional problems resolved in Christ. You know, can the experience of suffering lead us to God? Well, yes. If Christ crucified has placed himself at the center of every darkness, the darkness of death, the darkness of injustice, the darkness of losing loved ones, of losing friends, whatever that darkness may be, if we realize that on the cross, Christ has placed himself at the very center of all those things, then actually the emotional journey of suffering is no longer a journey into darkness. It's a journey to Christ, because Christ is the light that shines in the darkness. And so our emotions can lead us to Christ, and in him lead us to resolution. So I can just see from the looks on people's faces, and I'm guessing from those on the stream as well, but there's a lot to think about there. I've written some questions which may or may not be helpful. Feel free to go through them in any order you like, and whichever order takes your, and whichever one you think is most important for your table to discuss. There's something that looks at that cultural question, there's something that looks at a logical question, something that looks at a moral question, something that looks at an emotional question, something that looks at a pastoral question, but in all of them, the question behind the question is, okay, how does this insight lead us to Christ, him crucified, and him be the one who resolves these questions that we have in our hearts about pain and suffering? Sound good? Brilliant. Let's get on with it then. Hello, everyone, and people on the stream and whatnot. Now, there are no questions this evening that have come through as the sort of official texted whatnot, so I've gathered together a couple of things from the room here we might talk about. So while I'm talking about those, if there is anyone in the stream locations that wants to do a question in, please do that now and we'll do our best with it. So just a couple of things that came up here that might be helpful both for people on the streaming occasion as well. We were talking a little bit about this difference between sort of the pastoral response and this sort of this rational response. It's certainly, and knowing the difference between the two is so, so important. Part of the point of the book of Job is where Job's friends come along and all their stuff to try and explain Job's suffering is a complete waste of time. It doesn't help Job pastorally, and actually it turns out ultimately not to be true. And so there's always a sense that, okay, it might be interesting to discuss this philosophy and all this sort of stuff, but I would hate us to take away from tonight this idea that, right, when my friend is going through a tough time, I need to give them a 3-point philosophy lecture on all this sort of stuff. That's not what it's about. It's also about is knowing the situation, and in that situation using what wisdom, what insight, what experience we have to somehow bring Christ there. I think the story I always think of in these situations is Mary and Martha going to the tomb of Lazarus with Jesus. What's really interesting there is, okay, personal tragedy, and also a personal sense of sort of, well, God, surely you could have done something about this. Yeah, there's a sense of pointlessness in it. Both the women basically say to Jesus the same thing. You know, Jesus, if you'd been here, this wouldn't have happened. So same situation, same cultural context, same question. And it's really interesting that Jesus answers those two same questions in two very, very different ways. To one of them, he gives a theology lecture. He says, I'm the resurrection, I'm the life. You know, those who come to me, etc., etc. He talks about heaven, he talks about the afterlife, he talks about theology. And the other woman, same question, same situation, he weeps with her. And it's just that sense of the wisdom of Jesus. And we've got to, I suppose, aspire to some of that same wisdom in our life. Yes, have a sense of understanding, of apology, of being able to give a reason for the hope we have in a world of suffering. But ultimately, it's actually the wisdom of joining the sufferer in that moment to help them hold on to Christ and help them to find Christ within that darkness. And whether that is through, and that can look like a whole range of different things. So to always have an awareness that the rational engagement of suffering is not the same as the pastoral, and we will often come unstuck if we try to confuse the two. So that was one. The other question that sort of came up a bit was just this realization that, yeah, what the Bible does seem to teach is that there are positive purposes for God within our life, for suffering within our life. One interesting thing is, though, I'm not aware of a promise of the Bible that says that one day God will sit down to us and explain to us personally why we went through that. So again, the story of Job is quite interesting. So as you might know, at the beginning of it, we the readers are given a little sort of insight into what's going on behind the scenes. And we get to see the Satan and God and all this stuff in heaven. And we see that God is sort of showing Satan that actually there's something powerful in the faith of this sufferer Job, that Satan can be as destructive as life, and yet the sort of the faith in God will overcome all things. God is defeating Satan through Job's suffering, if you like, with the narrative of the story. And yet poor old Job never gets told that. And he never gets told that at the end. All he gets told is, Job, you won't understand what I'm doing here. Can you understand the ways of God? No. But all you can do is taste and see that I'm good. And at the end of the story, there's resolution. So Job gets what he's lost restored in some sense. And yet what he never gets is an answer. And there is a sense to us as we engage with suffering, can we cope with a God like that in our lives too? Can we cope with a God who asks us to go through all sorts of things and says, there will one day be resolution, trust me in that, yet doesn't let us see either in this world or potentially even the world to come quite the reason for that? Can we cope that we may not be able to ever understand suffering? And again, one of the passages I look to quite commonly in that would be something like the Agony in the Garden. So with Jesus, if Jesus, Son of God, on the night before crucifixion says, God, really? Is there another way? Do I have to do this? And yet, not my will, but yours. And it's a beautiful image, really, when you think about it. Here is the new Adam, the second Adam, in a garden being asked to be faithful to the will of God. Only in this case, the will of God is not the fruit of a tree, but the blood of a cross. And it's just that sense, if Christ was faithful and Christ didn't in human terms understand or want or get it in that humanity, is there something there that can connect with our experience of following God on this road of a cross? Again, that's probably more of a sort of a pastoral reflection than a sort of strictly theologically rational one, but I hope there's a thought in there that might be useful. That's me waffling away and filling time. Laura, have we had any more questions come on in? That's a shake of a head, in which case I do genuinely hope that people have found stuff here helpful, both for some sort of understanding and